Hello, it is the same day and I am wearing the same clothes. So, I wanted to continue talking about Indigenous issues in the US. And I thought that an interesting place to start would actually be an outlier, specifically an issue that is not directly caused or related to land back per se, but is intrinsically tied with the colonization that these tribes have faced, and that's the plight of Indigenous women. So, if you don't know, which many people don't, back before colonization, many tribes, not all, but many tribes were actually very egalitarian. That doesn't mean that women could do everything that men could do, but women did have a certain amount of possibility for political and economic power and say, really. And just in general, they weren't treated the same way that European women were treated. This even translated to names in a lot of tribes being matrilineal, where instead of taking the husband's name, you would take the wife's maiden name. That just goes to show the different sort of mindset that a lot of tribes had regarding gender. And that all changed, of course, after colonization, because many tribes were either forced or tried to assimilate to become like the European settlers. And of course, their gender relations were much different. They treated women very much as not being able to do any of the things that men could, not possessing any of that sort of political or economic power in most cases. So a lot of tribes relegated their women to those roles. And when they didn't, they were forced to eventually, because if they wanted to deal with these settlers, with these colonists, then they essentially had to send men forward and not women, because women wouldn't be respected or taken seriously. And what this ultimately gets to is, in the present day, Indigenous women now suffer massive discrimination. There's actually whole movements dedicated to the plight of Native Indigenous women just going missing and disappearing, being kidnapped, being murdered, or worse. Oftentimes by white men who come onto reservations, but also sometimes by Indigenous men as well. And this is usually marked by the red handprint across the mouth. So that's obviously an important movement and an important issue and struggle that is going on in the community right now. As far as issues that are more relevant directly to the land back movement, you of course have the struggles that Indigenous youth are going through, specifically those on reservations. We see this in Black communities as well, where when you have these communities where there is no money involved and there's these marginalized groups, it's easy for a lot of these kids to fall in with crime, to fall in with drugs or alcohol addiction, or just to drop out of school in general. This delinquency is very high in these communities, largely because of the lack of intrinsic wealth tied to any of these groups, because of the lack of land. And the final issue that I wanted to shed some light on is just the issue of representation within the media. Generally speaking, when you see an Indigenous person, a Native American, in your media, it's not an actual Indigenous person talking about their struggles or issues. It's not a story from an Indigenous creator writing about their unique perspective or incorporating actual mythology or themes from their tribe. It's white people appropriating those things for their own stories and often misrepresenting them, or it's cartoonish representations of Native people. And you see this the most with sports teams, for example, where you just see these cartoonish representations. You see a racial group turned into a mascot, which would not go with any other race, but just goes to show how marginalized natives are and how little people really care about treating them with respect. And this has a problem for a multitude of reasons. For one, it makes it harder for Indigenous people, especially younger Indigenous people, when you look in the media and you don't see anyone to aspire to that looks like you, that goes through what you go through. That can be really hard. But also, you get into this issue where white people see that, and they only see this romanticized or this fantasy version of these people. And it's easy for them to either think that Indigenous people were a thing in the past, you know, and are kind of there, but they're kind of ephemeral. They're not really like people that have struggles and can be helped in the modern day. Or just in general, they come to see them as something of a joke or a stereotype, the noble savage or just the savage. And this obviously makes it harder for them to honestly sympathize with Indigenous struggles and then try to help those communities the way that you see with white allies helping the LGBTQ plus community, or cishet people, I should say, or white people helping in the civil rights protests, you know? So it's an unfortunate issue that can really, most of these things can only be solved by giving more respect and care and representation to Indigenous people and their struggles. And we're starting to see brief shifts. There's been more representation for Black Americans and for Asian Americans, but hopefully we can start to see more for Indigenous people next. Because they're one of the groups in most dire need of it. And when the representation starts to go up, I'm certain that there will be a greater eye towards helping to alleviate these struggles that the community has gone through. This obviously isn't all there is to it. You can go and find other videos from people who are more Indigenous than me, probably who have grown up on a res, who can tell you more about these struggles. But this is to hopefully make a relatively palatable introduction, while also helping me pass a class. So hey, double win. Well, anyways, I hope you enjoyed watching, whoever stumbled upon this, and thank you very much. And I hope you learn something and grow to care about these issues and try to help out where you can. Thank you very much.